It's July 2007, and in a small police station in Victoria's Kiewa Valley, Officer in charge Peter Greaves is putting the kettle on and sitting down to talk with his friends, Jim and Cath McDougall.
I think it was the first time I'd ever seen Jimmy really concerned and serious about something. He was very, very stony-faced.
He's the only police officer at the station in Tangambalanga. It's a small town, and he's used to people popping in unexpectedly. Jim and Cath aren't here for a catch-up though. They need Peter's help.
And Jimmy said, look, I'm not sure what to do about this.
Jim and Cath told Peter their 27-year-old daughter Chantel, her partner Simon Kadwill, and their 5-year-old granddaughter Leela had recently moved from a small town in Western Australia to an off-grid community in Brazil. But they seem to have disappeared.
We've had no contact from Chantel since she left. She told Cathy that she would get back to her as soon as they got settled somewhere to let them know that they were safe and everything was fine.
They had no idea where she was or if she'd even made it to Brazil.
And so they've tried making phone calls and they've tried sending emails and they've tried all these other things and nothing happened.
I'm Dominique and this is episode 5, Simon Says. Peter had moved to the Tangambalanga station 1 year earlier, after about 11 years in the Melbourne Crime Department.
I worked in drugs, the child exploitation unit. I did a stint at the homicide squad. I worked with the National Crime Authority on a joint task force, which was to do with the importation of heroin from Asian countries.
And with all that experience behind him, he's worried.
There was elements of the way Chantel had to live her life which showed a perspective of control. And when you get that control, it also then starts to trigger, is there violence?
Peter had known Jim and Cath for 14 years. They're old four-wheel driving buddies. And he's heard about Chantel's strange relationship with Simon Kadwill. Now he tells them they need to report her missing in Western Australia, where the family lived. But when Jim contacted the WA police, he was told to fill out an online missing persons report. Jim felt like the police weren't taking it seriously. As far as police knew, an adult woman and her family had moved overseas. There's no crime in that. But knowing what he did, Peter thought it needed looking into. So he hit the phone.
So I contacted Sergeant Taylor at Nannup Police, who was the officer in charge at Nannup, and spoke to him about what was going on.
Once Peter explained the situation to the Nannup officer, Sergeant Taylor knew straight away exactly who Peter was calling about. And it turns out he had his own suspicions about Simon Kadwill.
He said, look, I have serious concerns about him because he's a very odd guy.
You might remember Sergeant Taylor was the officer who turned up when Chantel's ex, Simon Cookerman, went to Nannup in 2004 and had started claiming that Simon Kadwill wasn't who he said he was. At the time, Sergeant Taylor had fired off an email to a colleague asking them to look into it. They replied a couple of days later saying they'd done some checks, but nothing came up. But it was still there in the back of Sergeant Taylor's mind when in May 2007, just 2 months before the disappearance, he pulled Kadwill over for speeding. Sergeant Taylor started asking about his ID, and Kadwill had reacted strangely. The very next day, Chantel lodged an application for Leela's passport. Sergeant Taylor didn't know about the passport, but he was still surer than ever that something was off. He relays all this down the phone to Peter, then says he'll go and take a look around for him.
Jeff went to the house, had a look, and he told me that the house looked like people had just walked out the door. Everything was still in situ, furniture, all that sort of stuff. He thought that was really odd, that if someone was moving to the other side of the world, that the house would be sort of packed up to a certain degree. And from that, I started to become more concerned about what was going on.
Peter knows that missing persons cases aren't always given top priority. So he takes what Sergeant Taylor was able to discover on the ground for him and starts to work his contacts. Bank investigators he knew from his time working in fraud confirmed that no money had gone out of the accounts since the date that they said they were going overseas. Immigration confirmed no one had used their passports to leave the country. He discovers Chantel sold her car 3 days before they disappeared, but the dealer doesn't remember much. He thought an older guy had been waiting outside for her, but he couldn't be sure. Untouched bank accounts, no proof they'd left the country. Peter had to get creative.
I started looking at potentially what other processes could there be to leave the country without trace. And the only things I could come up with was via maybe a cargo vessel in Fremantle, or perhaps a private boat or something like that.
But to be smuggled onto a cargo ship or using a private boat to try to travel to the other side of the world would have taken money and contacts.
It's not the sort of thing you walk out to a commercial freighter docked at a port in Fremantle and say, "Oh, excuse me, mate, could we hitch a ride? Just don't tell anybody we're going with you." So I could pretty much rule that out.
The dead ends are mounting, and so too are Peter's fears for Chantel and Leela McDougall.
And so I was starting to think, this is not going to end well.
You're taking a movie, aren't you? You are taking a movie.
When Jim McDougall next drops into the station, Peter has to break the news to his friend.
I do remember saying to him, "Look, it's too early to make any sort of decisions about what's happened or what's happening or where we're at yet. But for me, the signs are not good when people who need money to survive aren't using or accessing that money."
Peter watched Jim, who could make a joke out of any situation, take in what Peter was telling him.
I remember, very clearly about Jimmy being really pretty much knocked over that day, because I think the reality of where things were started to actually sink in, that potentially this could be quite bad.
What was it like for you to have that conversation?
You often hear people talk about the police putting on the blue suit. It takes you away from all connection, all emotion, everything else. But this case, it was like trying to tell a close friend something that they didn't want to hear.
Peter writes up everything he's found in an official report to send off to WA Police. Peter thinks if he runs this up the police chain, they'll be obliged to take a decent look at it. He's done all he can from the other side of the country to help a mate out. Then Peter got a call from Sergeant Taylor that changed everything.
The next thing I heard, which was quite some time later, was that there was potentially Simon Kadwill had been arrested.
Simon Kadwill, detained in the UK. That's a long way from Brazil or Nannup. There's an international Interpol alert against his name. He's listed as a suspect. And now he's turned up nowhere near either of those places. The House of Cards was about to come crashing down.
Simon Kadwill that we knew as Simon Kadwill was not actually Simon Kadwill. That the person that was detained was actually the real Simon Kadwill.
Hang on. There are already too many Simons in this story. To be crystal clear, we now have another, the real Simon Kadwill, who is very much not the man Chantel has been living with for the past 10 years. So who the hell was the man police had just arrested in the UK? And who was the man living with Chantel in the blue house?
This person, who we thought was Simon Kadwill, was actually a person by the name of Gary Felton. And he'd been travelling on that false passport.
Simon Kadwill's true identity was Gary Felton. He'd spent years lying about who he really was. Chantel's ex-boyfriend, Simon Kadwill, had been telling the truth. He'd seen a letter written by Gary Felton, signed as Gary, and he tried to warn Chantel and the police 3 years before. So who was Gary Felton? And if he was lying about who he was, what else was he capable of? My producers and I have been scouring around to try and find out who this man, Gary Felton, was before he became someone else. We find a birth record that looks like his. Born in West Ham, England in 1962. So we start hitting up nostalgic Facebook pages of the area and hit lucky. We start sending messages. Then they start coming back.
Not really sure how old we would have been then, maybe 20-ish. He gave me a lift. I remember thinking after what a good lad he was, and that I probably never got to know him that well.
Someone else went to primary school with him.
All I can really remember was at the time he was good at art and obsessed with horror, even at the age of 11.
Another person, a woman who was friends of friends, asks why we're interested.
What do you mean? He's gone missing. Did he just leave his family, or is there violence or drugs involved or something? Because he wasn't a violent person.
She also says he was a punk, very clever, tall and really good looking. A nice guy.
Been scouring my photos. That's me in the front, red bondage trousers. The Indian guy to my right is called Fubba, and he was one of Gary's best friends. And the guy standing directly behind him to the right, you can just see, is Gary.
You can't see much, other than that he's tall. But we have something else now, a nickname of his best friend. No one we've been messaging with is up for an interview. But thanks to this intel, I've found two people I'm hoping will give me precious insight into who Gary Felton was before he became Simon Kadwill. A couple called Adrian and Davis, aka Fubba. And they've agreed to a call. So with the time difference, I set my alarm for 3:30 in the morning. I spoke to them for over an hour. They also decline an interview, but are happy to share what they know. In the 1970s, Davis became best friends with Gary at the age of 12. They bonded over punk music. They loved the Sex Pistols, Adam and the Ants, Slaughter and the Dogs. They went to a pretty rough school, and Gary was tall and gangly and stood out in the crowd. He would get bullied and beaten up by the older students. Davis tells me how Gary was always messing about, but never got in serious trouble. Gary Felton's teenage years sound kind of rough, but fairly normal working class English living. It sounds like it's in Gary's early 20s that his life begins to head in a different direction. When I ask if they knew Gary started going by another name, I'm surprised when they say yes. Gary Felton started travelling overseas for months at a time. But during one of his visits back to the UK, in 1994, he starts asking his friends to call him Simon. He told Davis he'd committed computer fraud and didn't want to be found out. He says he stole the identity from a dead baby. After the call, I start looking to see if I can confirm this, because everything I've been reading says he stole a colleague's identity. I can't find any death record for a baby called Simon Kadwill in any likely year. What I can find is a man, very similar age to Gary, going by the name Simon Kadwill Kelly, who advocates against identity fraud. It takes a while. A few unanswered emails, a follow-up text, a sorry, who's this again from Simon. But eventually I managed to connect with him via video call when he's on holiday in Thailand.
My name's Simon Kadwill Kelly, and around about 40 years ago, I met Gary Felton.
This is probably going to get confusing. So for clarity, from here the man we've known as Simon Kadwill, I'll call Gary. And Simon, well, he's actually Simon, the real one. And this Simon Kadwill story has never been recorded before.
We were work buddies in a sales department in a company called Ferrari Software. He was a kind of fun guy, quite happy-go-lucky, good sense of humour.
By now it was the 80s. Gary was in his 20s, well built, into bodybuilding. He'd ditch the suit and hit the gym after work.
People would take the mickey out of him because he would have his nutritional shakes for lunch whilst everyone else was having just, sandwiches and stuff.
And he was good for a laugh.
Yeah, we just sort of, hit it off, and it led into going to a nightclub or a party, and soon enough we had a little group of sort of party people where we would each have a party in rotation.
Simon and Gary became mates. These parties sound pretty 80s and a lot of fun.
We would hire tech stuff like a smoke machine, lasers, DJ consoles. Sometimes we'd hire a marquee and have a pig roasting. So they were quite flamboyant kind of parties. We would work hard in the week and then party hard Friday, Saturday, recover a bit on Sunday, and then do the same the next weekend.
During these parties, they would drink and smoke weed, always in the privacy of a home they were kicking on at. And Gary was also partial to other things.
I do remember Gary did like LSD. I think nowadays it's something that people don't tend to do, but back then it was more popular.
This actually squares with something Adrian and Gary's best mate from school, Davis, told me, that when he started working at that software company, Gary was introduced to LSD, and Davis said it changed him. What he actually said was that he thinks it blew his mind. And from there, he started getting into New Age spirituality. From that point onwards, Davis describes Gary Felton as a loony. His words, not mine. Seeing him pretty well every day though, Simon didn't notice any immediate changes. But one day, about a year after they'd been friends, Gary was over at Simon's. And for some reason, Simon was showing him his birth certificate.
I never thought that my birth certificate would suddenly go astray without my knowledge.
Simon can't remember if it was weeks or months later, but when he needed it again, he couldn't find it.
Because he was the only person that knew where it was or had seen it, I said to him, I can't find it. Do you remember where I put it? And he told me that he borrowed it. And I said, why? Why would you want to do that, and why didn't you ask me? And he wouldn't return it. Some things are acceptable, some things are not. And that was not. He explained that he'd used my birth certificate to get a new license.
Simon remembers that Gary had lost his for drink driving.
I was horrified, but that was short-lived because after that he went travelling.
Simon thought that was the end of it. After around a year, they both left the software company, and Gary began taking these sabbaticals to India, which continued through the 90s.
He would say that he'd gone to India to find some inner spiritual peace.
And when he was home, Gary tried to share this newfound spiritual utopia with Simon.
He would come back enthusiastic about being in India and say what a great thing it is, and why don't I change my lifestyle and find more peace and harmony and connection with the universe.
But Simon was quite happy with his life. Work and then a party on the weekend to let off steam.
Part of me also said that he'd like to still come back to that normal day-to-day tech life, with computers, and I think he enjoyed the contrast.
I've always wondered at this contradiction in Gary too. The New Age spirituality and fear of electromagnetic frequencies, alongside the massive computer setup and late night hours on the web.
He sort of gave up on society working 9 to 5, and he seemed to have the amount of money to do it.
I still don't really know how Gary financially supported himself in Australia either. Clearly Chantel worked hard, and it seems that for a number of years before they moved to Nannup, Simon Kadwill was a follower and transferring Gary money. But his computer setup wouldn't have come cheap in the early 2000s, and I haven't been able to pin down what his income stream was.
He always had a girlfriend, or maybe two. I think he liked to be kind of a bit controlling with his relationships. You know, like want to know where they are, what they're doing, that sort of thing. He'd seek those kind of women.
Here it is again, the control thing. From what I've heard from a number of people, this era of Gary, going back and forwards to India, seeking spiritual enlightenment, was a real shift away from the young punk who liked to party, or the bodybuilder who'd don a suit for work and light up the weekends with lasers and synthesizers at a house party. It's like he was a chameleon, reinventing himself along the way. His friends say he started out a staunch atheist. He didn't believe in any kind of religion. But then he began talking about having godlike experiences and meeting aliens who could cure cancer. Anyway, Simon Kadwill, the real one, just kept living his life as Gary sort of faded out of it, until Simon needed to get some medical treatment.
I was in extreme pain in my lower back and leg and had been for some while.
It had been recommended he get surgery, so he booked an appointment with his GP.
She confronted me and said, "I've already had an operation."
Simon is really confused. He tries to tell her that he hasn't, that he's in a lot of pain.
I said, "Look, this is not the case. You've made a mistake." And she didn't believe me. So she asked me, have I ever had any psychiatric problems, suggesting that maybe I'm leading a dual life, or I've got a memory loss, or, you know, schizophrenia or something like that.
When Simon refused to say he'd had the surgery, the doctor refused to see him anymore. When he did find a doctor who believed him, he got hold of these medical notes, and something stuck out to him.
And I recognised one of the addresses in Chertsey, Surrey, as being Gary's temporary address. And I thought, this is strange. So then I went to the police.
It took some doing and a lot of time proving he was really who he said he was. But finally, it became clear that Gary had not just used Simon's birth certificate to get a license. He'd built an entire new identity around it. Slowly, more and more things were coming to light. As well as the license, the medical fraud, Gary had bought property under Simon's name, had even invited Simon to a party there. But it was when Simon was making his way back home after a holiday to France that the extent of Gary's deception really came home.
I was coming back from France on a ferry, and I got pulled over to one side. I thought, okay, they're just doing like a routine car check. They asked me to go into the border control offices, sat me down in a room. The first question they said to me was, when was I last in Australia? I was rather puzzled at the question because I haven't been to Australia. And I said, I haven't been to Australia. And they said, well, we need to ask you lots of questions about what you've been doing and where you've been.
Simon asks what this is all about, but they won't say. They ask a lot of questions. Then they say he's wanted by Interpol, and he starts to get scared.
They showed me a picture of me, supposedly, and said that the picture of Gary looked rather like me. I said, no, that's not me, but I knew who it was.
Gary Felton, along with Chantel, Leela and Tony, had gone missing on the other side of the world. And Interpol had put out an alert for anyone travelling on a passport as Simon Kadwill. This is the arrest that Peter heard about. Simon Kadwill turning up in the UK. Actually, just a man looking forward to getting home from holiday. Eventually, Simon was let through and into the country. This same debacle would happen for years. He ended up changing his name, adding the Kelly, so it would stop. And a lot of time has passed since then. It also sounds like it just happened so often. He ended up almost having to laugh at it.
In fact, one time I got stopped by the police, routine check, by the roadside. They looked me up and they said, "We can see here there's a warrant for your arrest." And I said to them, almost with a smile, I said, "Oh, is that for kidnapping and murder?" And they said, "Yes." Can you imagine saying that at the roadside?
Possible kidnapping and murder. As I was talking to Adrian and Davis on that early morning call, I sense that they still feel a lot of disbelief about how Gary's life turned out. With all of Gary's old friends, it strikes me that despite everything, they don't really seem angry at him. Baffled maybe, but not antagonistic. Like they remember what a good time they had, the friends they were.
My opinion is that initially it was probably to do with his driving licence. And I just think that he maybe got carried away. Maybe his mind started to think, well, if I can do that, maybe I can do this. He never struck me as somebody who would kidnap somebody or, want to murder somebody.
Everything I've read about this whole case, Gary Felton is painted as this shady character who appeared out of nowhere one day and turned everyone's world upside down. But the stories I'm hearing give so much context to how Gary Felton became Simon Kadwill. It's like finding out the Wizard of Oz was just a small man with a microphone.
Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
It also makes sense of all these strange little moments in the years leading up to the Four's disappearance. Chantel's call to Jim about fudging some paperwork to get him in the country again, that he wasn't on Leela's birth certificate, not letting Jim take his photo, the way he reacted when Sergeant Taylor pulled him over and questioned his ID, moving ever further away if he felt like people were getting too close. I found myself wondering how much Chantel knew about all this, or if she, just like her parents, Jim and Cath, thought Simon Kadwill was just who he said he was. If when she spoke about needing to do something to get him into the country, she knew his real name wasn't Simon Kadwill. In the months after Peter typed up his investigations and sent it to his West Australian counterparts, the police were trying to piece together the trail of breadcrumbs. There were still no answers.
Yeah, well, the investigation went on for quite a while, then just more questions, more answers, no answers.
Opportunities to speak to people who might have seen something dried up. Jim and Cath felt helpless. But there was one date coming up that they were hanging on for. The one day of the year Chantel would call, without fail, wherever she was in the world. Christmas. Was she going to call? And if she didn't, would they have to accept she was really gone?